All right, it looks like folks are coming in fast and furious, and we've got a large group with us already, which is fantastic. So I will kick off the program by welcoming everyone to today's congressional briefing on focused ultrasound, hosted by the Focused Ultrasound Foundation. My name is Chris Cooper, and I am a government affairs director at G2G Consulting. I am thrilled to be the moderator for today's congressional briefing, as I spent the past 12 years working on Capitol Hill and understand how helpful these educational briefings can be for staff, whether you're a staff assistant, a legislative aide, or a chief of staff. I've had the pleasure of working alongside Dr. Jessica Foley and the Focused Ultrasound Foundation to educate policymakers on focused ultrasound therapy and how it has transformed care for patients suffering from conditions like Parkinson's disease, prostate cancer, and fibroids. This non-invasive, non-pharmacological platform technology has the potential to improve the lives of millions of patients with a variety of medical disorders beyond those that I just mentioned, and is currently being explored for more than 180 other indications. I hope you find today's briefing insightful. With that, I would now like to welcome Senator Mark Warner of Virginia to share opening remarks. Senator Warner was elected to the U.S. Senate in November 2008 and re-elected to his third term in 2020. He currently serves as chairman of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence and as a member of the Senate Finance, Banking, and Rules Committees. The senator has established himself as a bipartisan leader in Congress and has served as a key author and negotiator of several pieces of critical legislation. He has also been a longtime champion for focused ultrasound therapy and the Focused Ultrasound Foundation since its inception, and we are very grateful for his ongoing support. Senator Warner.
Hi, I'm Virginia Senator Mark Warner, and I'm glad to welcome you to this briefing on focused ultrasound. As you know, focused ultrasound is a high priority in Virginia. We have the Ultrasound Foundation located in Charlottesville. We've got great research partners like Virginia Tech and UVA. And I am so excited about the potential of this non-invasive therapy that can be used in so many different domains. I remember my dear friend Neil Cassell introducing me to this technology literally a couple decades ago. And to have seen the progress that has been made is really remarkable. We know that focused ultrasound is already used in areas like prostate cancer and essential tremor. But what is really exciting is that focused ultrasound has the potential to be used in over 150 other disease states. Everything from chronic back pain to Alzheimer's to dementia to Parkinson's to a host of other areas. The idea of using this, again, non-invasive technology across a wide range of disease states, it could really be transformative. I hope you all will help continue to talk about advances in this field. As a legislative champion, I'd like to find more ways to bring this therapy to the table, to patients in a quicker, faster way that requires working with FDA and other licensing bodies. But we need to make sure the research continues as well. I hope this briefing will be very powerful. And again, I hope you will count on my office as U.S. Senator, and again, as a former technology guy myself, somebody that will be an ally as we bring this remarkable therapy to benefit more people around the country and around the world.
A big thank you to Senator Warner for his remarks today. We truly appreciate your strong leadership in Congress to support focused ultrasound research and bring this non-invasive therapy to patients more quickly. And without further ado, I will now introduce our wonderful panelists who will share different perspectives around focused ultrasound and the promise it holds. Dr. Jessica Foley is the Chief Scientific Officer and Managing Director of Government Affairs at the Focused Ultrasound Foundation. She joined the foundation in 2012 after a more than 11-year career in the field of focused ultrasound, that spanned academic, industrial, and government worlds. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Foley. Next, we will have Terri Freson, who is a mother, grandmother, and a focused ultrasound patient for neuropathic pain. Welcome, Terri, and thank you for sharing your story with the audience today. After Terri, we will hear from Dr. Roger Packer, who is director of both the Gilbert Family Neurofibromatosis Institute and the Brain Tumor Institute of Children's National Hospital. Throughout his career, Dr. Packer has been heavily involved in clinical and applied basic science research. His clinical research has touched on various aspects of adult and child neurology and neuro-oncology, including pediatric brain tumors. Thank you, Dr. Packer. And rounding out our panel today, we have Dr. Noah Phillip, who is a professor of psychiatry and human behavior at Brown University and lead for mental health research at the Center for Neurorestoration and Neurotechnology at VA Providence. Dr. Phillip's laboratory uses a precision approach to new and emerging technologies with the goal to understand and treat post-traumatic stress disorder, major depression, and suicidality. Thank you, Dr. Phillip. With that, it is wonderful to see you all, and I will now turn it over to our first speaker, Dr. Jessica Foley with the Focused Ultrasound Foundation.
Thank you, Chris, for the introduction, and I'd also like to thank Senator Warner for his support over the years. It's really great to have you as an ally in Congress. So really thrilled to be here today to speak to you about Focused Ultrasound. As Chris mentioned, I'm with the Focused Ultrasound Foundation, and we are a 501c3 organization. We're based in Charlottesville, Virginia, but we work with researchers all over the world to really drive Focused Ultrasound's impact all over the world. We have become the catalyst to accelerate the development and adoption of Focused Ultrasound. So what is Focused Ultrasound? Most of you are familiar with ultrasound for diagnostics purposes, for imaging, but this is now using ultrasound for therapy. So this is a non-invasive therapeutic technology, and it really can be an alternative or a complement to more conventional forms of treatment, things like surgery, radiation, drug delivery for chemotherapy or immunotherapy. And it has a potential to transform the treatment of patients with many different diseases and ultimately transform their lives. So the biggest selling point is that it's non-invasive. So that means in most cases, this is an outpatient procedure. No incisions means less pain, limited or no need for post-procedure pain meds like opioids, which is fantastic. Also, often this means decreased complications, things like infection or tissue damage that could occur with incision treatments. This is most often leading to a more rapid recovery, improving outcomes for patients, and ultimately lowering costs to our healthcare system. So currently, Focused Ultrasound, as I mentioned, is in use all over the world. There have now been over 560,000 patients treated around the world. And I'll talk a little bit about some of those applications that they've been treated with. There are also many new applications in clinical research as well as in laboratory research. But what's important is now there are 9 Focused Ultrasound applications that have been cleared by the FDA. Those are benign prostatic hyperplasia, bone metastases, essential tremor, liver tumors, osteoid osteoma, Parkinson's dyskinesia and Parkinson's tremor, prostate cancer, and uterine fibroids. So how does Focused Ultrasound work? So as this video shows, it's similar to the way that a magnifying glass would focus beams of sunlight onto a leaf and burn a hole in the leaf. Except in this case, you're targeting many beams of ultrasound to a spot deep in the body, say a tumor, for instance, and only where the beams converge will you have a profound effect in the tissue. Could be heating, could be other effects as well. And importantly, as the beams pass through other tissues, whether it's skin, muscle, fat, there will be no impact there, and it will just be harmless, kind of like ultrasound imaging. And so that's what's really unique about this technology, is the real precision of this focus. I think this slide best exemplifies the real transformative nature of focused ultrasound for patients. Here's a gentleman suffering from essential tremor. You can see how difficult it is for him to move jelly beans from one container to another. He was actually an architect who had to stop practicing because of this. You can see in the next slide how difficult it is for him to draw and stay within the lines. Then this is an MRI of his brain. You can see the blue region is indicating the small region in the center of the brain where there are cells that are misfiring and causing the tremor. So next, what the neurosurgeon will do is target over 1,000 beams of ultrasound to that spot deep in the brain and treat that region with the ultrasound, trying to heat and kill just those small number of cells that are misfiring. During the procedure, the patient is awake with no anesthesia. And as you can see listed here, no incisions and the like. You can next see how the resulting image looks in the MRI. You can see just a small dark region again in the center of the brain by this red arrow. And that's all that needed to be treated to get rid of his tremor. You can see next how he can now easily draw right after the procedure. And then the video in his follow-up, how seamlessly he can move these jelly beans from one container to another. So this trial was done several years ago, and now essential tremor has been, again, FDA approved. It's now covered by Medicare in all 50 states, and there have been over 10,000 patients around the world treated for this condition. And this treatment has then led to many other neurological disorders, treatments for them, which we'll discuss a little bit more today. Next slide. This is also showing how the treatment of cancer can be done. This is, for example, in a pancreatic tumor, and you can see here a large tumor that then in the middle image shows up dark as it's been treated by the focused ultrasound. Again, the tissue has been deadened with the heat, and then you can see just how it resorbs over time, and that's why there's just a small mass left on the right. In the next slide, what's important is just that there are metastatic tumors that decreased in size in some of these patients as well, even though only their primary tumor was treated. So that was indicating a systemic response to focused ultrasound treatment, which has also been something powerful that we've learned about the technology over the years. Next slide. It's also important that focused ultrasound is very precise and accurate. There's a sharp demarcation between treated and untreated tissue, as you see here, which is incredibly important in places like the brain where there are sensitive structures all nearby and you don't want to have off-target effects. So all in all, I mentioned the heating that focused ultrasound can do, that thermal ablation, but there are many different ways that focused ultrasound can actually interact with tissues in the body. There's over 20 different biological effects. And we'll talk about some of these today. And what I think you'll notice is how these differing effects can enable us to treat differently, even in the same organ. So when we talk about the brain and we're treating nerve cells, depending on how we are using the ultrasound, we have many different ways in which we can treat those cells. Next slide. So first, as I mentioned, focused ultrasound can destroy diseased tissue. So that is done, one, through thermal ablation, which you'll hear a little bit more about. That is just a quick, precise way of heating a group of cells, and this could be something as small as was done for the tremor, or as large as treating a whole tumor. Then there's also using mechanical disruption to treat the cells, and that's something called histotripsy, which is just a different mode of destroying the cells. Next slide. The focused ultrasound can also be used to enable localized drug delivery. This can be done in many different ways. One that you'll see here on the next slide is if you would load if you could move just to the next slide. So you can see these are microbubbles. That's just something conventionally used in ultrasound imaging. But these bubbles are pretty small compared to blood cells. Next slide. But if you would load these bubbles with chemotherapy agents or with other types of drugs, then, as you'll see in the next slide, you could actually inject these loaded microbubbles throughout the body. And you'll see in the next slide how they could accumulate throughout or circulate throughout the body, maybe accumulate in a site like the liver. And as they're traveling through the body, they're not having any effect because they're just these simple microbubbles. The drug is loaded up inside of them. And then in the next slide, you could see the ultrasound being applied to, in this case, a liver tumor, and only at the site of the tumor where the ultrasound is applied will those bubbles pop open and the drug will be released. So the drug will be released locally. So this becomes then a way of delivering localized chemotherapy without those systemic side effects that we're accustomed to in chemotherapy. Next slide. Another delivery mechanism you'll hear a little bit more from Dr. Packer, and this is how focused ultrasound can temporarily open the blood-brain barrier. So as microbubbles, again, you can use these microbubbles as they're flowing through the blood vessel, they can be used to help put pressure on the tight layer of cells that's on the inside of blood vessels that are in the brain. So these blood vessels in the brain have that tight layer of cells because they want to keep bad things out of the brain, things like viruses or toxins, but they can also keep good things out of the brain, whether it's chemotherapy, whether it's immunotherapy, whether it's drugs to treat neurodegenerative disorders. And so what the ultrasound is doing is oscillating these microbubbles to put pressure on that tight layer of cells to kind of open up the junction between the cells just enough so that the drugs can move from the bloodstream into the brain. And this is a really revolutionary use of the technology. You can see here the resulting image just in the MRI. On the right side, you see the bright region in the brain. That's just showing where the blood-brain barrier was opened. Next slide. And then I also alluded to the systemic response that can be created by focused ultrasound in the case of cancer. That can induce, that's basically an immune response. So what we've seen is that the focused ultrasound can induce an anti-tumor immune response. Tumors are really good at camouflaging themselves from the immune system, and the focused ultrasound can actually destroy that camouflage, disrupting the tumor cells, exposing antigens that then allow the immune system to recognize and attack the tumors. Paired with immunotherapy drugs, this can be a more effective way of treating a lot of tumors rather than just the immunotherapy alone. Next slide. So kind of as we look at all of these different mechanisms of action, that's really enabled now the treatment of more than 180 different clinical applications. These are all in various stages of development still. You can see by the progression of these arrows at each indication that many of these are still very early stage. They're still in the research stage, maybe not yet even into clinical trials, or some are in early stage clinical trials. And then there are several that have made it out to the red arrow where that's the FDA approval. And then even fewer have widespread reimbursement. So that is, as we'll talk about later, one of the barriers to getting these treatments to patients everywhere. But what we're going to hear about now is some, both from Terri as well as from our physicians, how focused ultrasound is being used in the brain. I had mentioned the essential tremor. That is how focused ultrasound as this versatile tool was used to heat cells in the brain and get rid of the tremor. Well, this versatile tool of focused ultrasound can do many things beyond the heating, as we kind of discussed. And so you'll hear a little bit about how some of those other uses of the technology enable other treatments in the brain.
Thank you very much, Dr. Foley. Really appreciate that introduction to focused ultrasound and the many ways that it can help patients and transform their lives. I would now like to turn it over to Terri Freson. She is a focused ultrasound therapy patient for chronic pain. Thank you for sharing your story with us today. And I will enable your video and take it away.
Hi, I'm Terri. Thanks, Chris, for asking me to be on this. I'm very honored to be here and to share my story and hopefully help other patients. So my story started back in 2017. I literally woke up and had excruciating back pain. So I went to the doctor, did some therapy, some medications, but medications don't normally work for me. So I ended up having a surgery in 2017 on my lower back. That failed. With that, I had another surgery in 2018, again on my back. That failed as well. During that surgery, after that surgery, I started having sensation on my ankle and my foot. I continued going back and forth for post-op appointments. Over the months, that pain went all the way up my leg and into my entire right buttock. So from the buttocks to my foot was extremely sensitive, extremely painful. A totally different pain than the back, and I could differentiate them. So my doctor, Sanser, was my neurosurgeon. He recommended the Focused Ultrasound study for me. I met with Dr. Gandhi and his team. They didn't feel at the time I was a candidate at first because it was only in the ankle and the foot. 2 years later, we realized that surgery failed as well. And by then, the pain was continuously on the right leg and foot. 2020, I had a third surgery, and that was a success, thankfully. October 2nd was the day of my daughter's wedding. While we were getting ready for the wedding, I got the call from Focused Ultrasound saying I was a candidate. Needless to say, we were so excited. 2 weeks later, we scheduled for me to meet with the team again. And I met with the team and they discussed everything, how they would shave my head. And I had all these papers to fill out, took some tests, and explained everything that would be happening at the time of the surgery. So we go to the surgery and not afraid, didn't care about the hair. I was just eager to get a miracle and help others. So with that, before that happened, 2 weeks prior, they sent a production crew to my house, like a movie crew. We did a whole story on me before the surgery. And then after the surgery, they came back a couple months later and finished the story. If you'd like to follow that, that is on YouTube. You look up Focused Ultrasound and Terri Freson. It's very interesting. I hope you enjoy it because it was very good. During all that time, I couldn't walk. I couldn't sit, along with the back and the leg. I couldn't get in and out of my car. I literally had to pull from the handrail up top. And with that, I tore the muscles in my arm and had to have another surgery. So I had to use a walker. I couldn't do absolutely anything. We couldn't go anywhere. I couldn't sit. I couldn't stand long. If I wanted to sit, I literally balled up my fist and sat on my fist to hold me up in the air. Following that, I continued on, had the procedure done the day of. They literally shave your head and they put like a little rubber cap on your head, and then you're taken into MRI. They start a water bath, and then they start the MRI, the sonications. So with the sonications, I didn't feel any of them. I was close to 6 sonications, and I started feeling something, so I asked them to stop. They told me I was doing great, and I was almost finished if I could hang on a little bit longer. So I did. I hung on for 7 sonications, which this team was high-fiving, sending my husband videos and texts telling him how great they did, that they hadn't gotten another 7 sonications on any other patient. Throughout the whole procedure, Dr. Gandhi would come in and check on me, feel my leg, feel my buttocks, my ankle, my foot. And during the sonication, each time the pain would go down. Miraculously enough, it was off the 10 charts, brought it down to a 2. Within weeks, it was gone, literally gone. That part of my chronic pain was completely finished. Still had the back pain again, could differentiate. So I always said to them, I didn't care about the hair. I just wanted to get better, and I wanted to help other people. Hopefully, my story will help push along with insurance and make this available to many other patients that have even worse conditions that I had. I'm still doing well from that. I do not have any residual pain at all in that entire leg. It's completely fine. So I'm happy to be here. I'm happy to talk to anybody. I'm happy to keep showing up to help other patients. And Focused Ultrasound was the most amazing thing that could happen to me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Terri, for sharing your inspiring story with us. Going beyond the science and learning about how this therapy can change patients' daily lives for the better is really powerful. So thank you so much. Next, we will hear from Dr. Roger Packer from Children's National Hospital. Dr. Packer, thank you for joining us. The floor is yours.
Hi, thank you very much for allowing me to speak and be part of this activity. Thank you to all of you for your interest, and also for all the people that have supported the program. My background is I'm a child neurologist who's run brain tumor programs for over the past 30 years. And the progress with childhood brain tumors has been real. Unfortunately, childhood brain tumors remain the leading cause of death of all forms of childhood cancer, and the leading cause of persistent neurologic deficits and morbidity even for survivors. So we have a big hill to climb with childhood brain tumors. Some we've made some real progress in, but unfortunately for our most deadly tumor, the brainstem glioma, which you've often seen characterized on TV, a deep-seated tumor, it can't be removed surgically. It occurs in about 20% of all childhood brain tumors. That essentially 90% of kids with this diagnosis are dead within 18 months of diagnosis. And overall survival is less than 1 or 2%, 2 years to 3 years after diagnosis. A tragic disease, and the only thing that works temporarily is radiation. Because of the location of the tumor, it can't be removed. And also because of the characteristics of the tumor, even after radiation, when we try to give in new therapies, chemotherapy, molecular targeted therapy, or immunotherapy, they can't reach the tumor because the tumor has an intact blood-brain barrier. And the barrier, as you saw earlier, blocks drugs from getting in. And because of that, whatever we give through the bloodstream or orally can't get to the tumor. This is where the possibility of focused ultrasound was so exciting, because as you saw by one of the cartoons earlier, by using these micro bubbles that you float them through the system and give the focused ultrasound non-invasively to the brainstem at a low enough dose that it won't hurt the surrounding normal tissue, you can get these bubbles to open up the barrier and let that leak in temporarily. And that's the important thing. The leaking is only for about 8 hours. Then the barrier closes. And the barrier is critical to try to keep other contaminants away from the brain. The risk of this is with high intensity focused ultrasound, you can't destroy the brainstem because the child can't survive. But with low intensity focused ultrasound, you can open up the barrier and rush in the drugs. And even on MRI, you could see a tumor that did not open up the barrier, that was not open up after focused ultrasound. So we installed the focused ultrasound system, the first children's hospital, and essentially the world that was had a focused ultrasound system purely for children. We installed it, and we did the first in-human trial starting in the past year. A second group has joined us in Toronto, and we're very excited that we can see the blood-brain barrier open up, and we're seeing how effective that is. We're also very excited that we were able to do this without hurting children. The concern was always when you put the focused ultrasound in the brainstem and you heat it up or you cause too much damage, the child can't survive. And we now know that we can do this non-invasively and aim only at the brainstem. That's the beauty of the technique, only at the brainstem and not hurt the surrounding brain. In a complementary study, we're giving a drug that does get into the brain tumor, but is not active. And with the focused ultrasound, we're essentially activating the drug in the brain tumor. And we've done probably over 30, 35 treatments now to show that can be done safely. So to be very honest, working in this field for better than 30 years, and these have been two of the major breakthroughs we've seen for the care of this tumor in the last 50 years. And that's exciting that we can do it safely. We know that we need to do it better. We are working closely with partners all across the world, including research with University of Virginia and Virginia Tech that are looking at what should we better put into the brain, what would work more effectively for the children. We know at this point that this is a limited type of treatment, but it is something that can be transferable to centers across the world once they install the focused ultrasound. It's not that technically difficult a procedure to do. And really, it could also be spread to other types of childhood brain tumors that have intact or relatively intact blood-brain barriers to attack those tumors that we can't remove surgically and we can't cure just with radiation. And chemotherapy is ineffective. So we're working now on the immunotherapy, trying to release the immune system out of these tumors, doing a lot of different things. And we're very excited about this. This can be done repetitively. As people know, this is through an intact skull. There's no surgery. Our surgeons call it non-invasive neurosurgery, which is sort of an oxymoron the way I grew up. But, it's really is a very potentially effective way to try to treat these diseases. And we're extraordinarily excited that we've made this much progress in a year. And we would hope with enough support and the understanding that we're treating diseases that are not otherwise treatable, that we can make real progress using this technology in the near future and cure more children. Really appreciate your time and thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Packer. We will now hear from our final panelist, Dr. Noah Phillip, about the promise of focused ultrasound for mental health conditions like anxiety and depression. Dr. Phillip, over to you.
All right. Thank you very much, Chris, and really appreciate the invitation. So good afternoon, everybody. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. And just before I start my presentation, I just want to mention that I am a federal employee. So my appearance here really is in a personal capacity and not in any capacity related to my employer with the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs. So all of the views expressed here are my own and do not reflect any VA position or really, for that matter, any of those of the agencies or foundations that help fund my research. So with that said, so I'm here to talk to you about the promise of focused ultrasound for mental health. So the impact of depression, of anxiety, of PTSD really just cannot be overstated. So as a VA psychiatrist, I see the impact and the destruction of these illnesses on my patients, on their families, on their loved ones. And my mission is to design, develop, and deploy new treatments that get people better and get them back to our lives. Now, just before I go into the promise of ultrasound to improve mental health, let me frame the scope of the challenge for you. So as many of you know, when someone has depression, anxiety, or PTSD, we have a number of treatments that we offer. And typically we start with things like medication. This is pharmacotherapy, or talk therapy, psychotherapy. And both of these have reasonable degrees of efficacy. But I think it is reasonable to say that neither of them really meet the needs of our patients, either because of side effects or access issues or otherwise. And then we have a challenge. So once medication and therapy don't succeed, what do we do? And in that case, we start to think about neuromodulation. And what is neuromodulation, you might ask? Here, what we're going to do is we're going to start thinking about using energy to help the brain function in a more healthy and normal fashion. The most common technology that we have is something called transcranial magnetic stimulation, essentially using magnets to help the brain to perform in a more normal way. And I'm demonstrating here with my wonderful laboratory manager at VA Providence, Emily Aiken. And so that's something that's available clinically. But then our challenge with this is that the energy here only gets to the top and really the outside of the brain. And unfortunately, the source of many of our psychiatric disorders is deep inside. So once if you will, the more superficial kinds of neuromodulation don't work, we start to think about bigger things, more invasive approaches. And many of you have heard about these. These are things like electroconvulsive therapy, sort of demonstrated here. And then when that doesn't work, we start to think about things that are much more invasive, in which case we start to think about things like deep brain stimulation. And here, this is a surgical procedure where leads are inserted into the brain and are used in extremely treatment-resistant or refractory cases. And really, of all of these that you're looking at on this screen, only deep brain stimulation can get to the so-called sources of these illnesses, but it requires surgery. And really, it's still considered experimental or available only under a very limited circumstance. So that brings us to the hope of focused ultrasound. And really, not to put too fine a point on it, what we hope is that we may have precise and non-invasive deep brain stimulation. And really, to give you a really concrete series of images, I'm going to put up a picture of a brain. So this is a brain. I've taken off the skull. I've taken off all the other bits, if you will. And this is the energy that we get into, or where we get into the brain with transcranial magnetic stimulation, that sort of most common kind of brain stimulation. And those yellow and red areas are the parts that we can stimulate. It's really just up on the top. And I want you to compare this to the precision and the focality of focused ultrasound. So really, we've gone something that's the size of roughly the fist to things that are closer to 1/8 of an inch, or really at millimeter or sub-millimeter scale. And I think you can immediately appreciate the precision of this technology. So in my research at VA Providence and Brown University, so we're conducting a first-in-human study of low-intensity focused ultrasound for depression and anxiety. And I want to emphasize here, we're using a low-intensity focused ultrasound, which is really the same amount of energy that you can get out of a diagnostic ultrasound machine, but done in a highly focal fashion. So the study is supported by the National Institutes of Mental Health and the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs, and overseen by the FDA through an investigational device exemption. So in this study, what we are doing is we're trying to see if we can safely, directly, and non-invasively calm down the amygdala. So depicted here, that little red almond shape represents the amygdala, as if you could see through the side of someone's head right into it. You may all recall from your high school biology that the amygdala is the seat, if you will, of the fight or flight system, and is very, very heavily involved in all of our psychiatric illnesses. So this is an imaginary image. And actually what we do, though, and I'll get to in a little bit, is this is another picture of the ultrasound. This is a brain atlas. So the things that we use to target the therapy, and that red arrow is showing the part of the brain that we are directly targeting at. And I want to really reiterate an important point here, that thinking about accessing the amygdala, thinking about accessing these deep parts of the brain, like you heard earlier, for example, the brainstem, this is completely impossible with any other technology. So in our study, we're using a particular device. This is going to be modeled by Steve Magnetti, who is one of our prior employees, a veteran and a prior staff member. The system that we are using is one of several. We happen to be using a brain sonic system. This is made by a California company. And when we start to put it on, it does look a little bit like a hockey puck strapped to the side of the head. So already you can see the setup is very different than the images that you saw earlier. Just to give you a schematic, this is what the device looks like. And I really just want to emphasize how small and how precise this is. So the energy comes out of the transducer and comes together in this little cigar-shaped oval or ellipsis. So this red area is just the tiny area that is getting sonicated. And in this case, we have something that is delivering energy at about 65 millimeters inside of the brain. The entire cigar here is about 30 millimeters wide, 30 millimeters long, pardon me, and 4 millimeters wide. Let me show you what this actually looks like in real life in this next video. So before I start the video, just to orient you, what I've done here is I put the transducer on a table. I put a cup of water on top of the transducer, and we're looking down on the top of the water. And what I want you to do is I want you to focus just on the very middle, if you will, of this cup of water. And I really want to use this video to demonstrate the precision and the gentle nature of the focused ultrasound. You can see that tiny little dot right in the middle. And what you're seeing is the water being pushed up towards you just a little bit. So less than 1/8 of an inch, really millimeters long and millimeters wide. So how do we do this, you might ask? Well, so we do this all inside of an MRI scanner. So we target the system while participants are awake and alert. So in the next video, what I'm going to show you is actually me doing some of the targeting. Here I'm demonstrating on one of my staff members. I'll let the video start and then I'll narrate as we go. I'm going to zoom in on the screen. You can see the person inside the scanner in the back. And there's a series of lines on the circles on the left-hand side. And this is really going to help me do the targeting. And I'll line up a series of different fiducials to get the beam to go where we want it to go. And this is all done really in real time based upon the individual person's brain using really a high degree of anatomical precision. What you're seeing in this screen is simply a screenshot of the targeting once it's done. On the left-hand side are these two rings, really allows us to target the beam, as I mentioned earlier, and the blue line and the green lines are showing where the beam is going to be traveling. So this is telling me exactly where the beam is going to go. And essentially what we've done is line up a series of perpendicular lines in three-dimensional space. And so as I start to wrap up and sort of start to bring this to a close, I think it's important to emphasize that the sky is the limit with this technology. And at the same time, the experience, the research, is a bit like building a ladder as you climb it. So this line of study is transformative. The hope is to create a new way to non-invasively help our patients and our veterans, and with the important lessons learned that we can then take to our service members and the general public. And that all said, and really why I'm here today, is that this is an incredibly expensive process and has multiple regulatory challenges that do slow down the research. This project really is the product of incredibly hard work from an absolutely wonderful team, which I'll show you in the next slide. But it's my hope that really after hearing this briefing today, that all of you who are listening and who are in positions of influence or power really can help find a way to increase funding and really make it easier for those of us in the research community to bring this technology forward. So in closing, I actually want to thank my participants who are in this study, really for their trust. For my wonderful team, they're all depicted here as Bitmojis. And really of the multiple federal agencies and foundations depicted here that support our work. And really just to close, really as a psychiatrist, as a physician, as a researcher, my goal is to get my patients back to their lives. And Focused Ultrasound has a tremendous potential to revolutionize mental health treatment. And thank you for your time and your attention. And I hope you will support all these efforts advancing this technology.
Thank you for that illuminating presentation, Dr. Phillip. I will now turn it back over to Dr. Foley to cover current barriers facing Focused Ultrasound and our call to action before we close out with a few questions from the audience. Dr. Foley.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you to all of my other panelists for really, I think, highlighting for you, the real versatile nature of focused ultrasound, whether it's high-intensity focused ultrasound for treating things like essential tremor or neuropathic pain, or low-intensity focused ultrasound for blood-brain barrier opening and getting drugs in to treat devastating childhood brain cancers, or again, low intensity focused ultrasound for neuromodulation for treating mental health conditions like depression, anxiety, even substance use disorder. So I think you can really see, again, the real versatile nature of this tool, of this focused ultrasound tool for treating many, many diseases. So then you may wonder, why doesn't everyone have access to this treatment? What are the barriers? So we've identified the primary barriers that we think that Congress can be particularly helpful in helping us address. One is just the lack of awareness of focused ultrasound and its potential among policymakers and funding agencies. We hope briefings like this will help to, again, raise the awareness, help us build champions within Congress. There's also a lack of insurance coverage and reimbursement, even for those focused ultrasound treatments that are FDA approved. And this is limiting patient access to promising therapies. And then, of course, there is more need for research funding to help advance particularly the innovative new focused ultrasound treatments, some of which you heard about today, that are really, really important, whether it's for children, whether it's for our veterans and service members. So it's incredibly important to continue to have that research funding. So this is just a snapshot of the current federal funding landscape for focused ultrasound. So what's interesting to note is that there are actually 16 separate institutes at NIH that have funded focused ultrasound research, and it's also being funded in the DoD, DARPA, NSF, VA. I'm sure ARPA-H will have some funding for focused ultrasound, but there's no formal coordination or information sharing across NIH institutes or government-wide to really understand what's being funded. Are there kind of opportunities for data sharing that could be helpful to make sure that we're funding the most important work, not redundant? How can maybe institutes work together to provide better types of funding? So all of that is something that we think is important to really assess the true scope of what's being funded government-wide. So the next slide. When we think about ways that Congress can help here, one in the research realm is to increase the level of funding. There are all these institutes funding, but not at significantly high levels, considering what focused ultrasound is capable of. So increasing the level of funding, and then also providing better coordination, again, of focused ultrasound research throughout the NIH and government-wide. Also helping to support policies that will enable timely reimbursement of focused ultrasound so that all patients can get access to this treatment as quickly as possible. And then finally, continuing to educate to raise awareness of the power and promise of focused ultrasound. So I hope that today we helped build some additional champions to help us as we move forward. Currently, this year, we do have an appropriations request in for fiscal year 2025. And this is really around that coordination piece at NIH. So as I mentioned, there are 16 institutes funding focused ultrasound research. This appropriations language would actually request that NIH would convene an annual symposium on focused ultrasound and form a cross-institute research group that, again, could help to better coordinate the research and also do an NIH-wide assessment of grants awarded over the past decade, again, so that we can see where things are lacking and where we actually need to invest more money moving forward. So again, I thank you all for coming today and for learning about focused ultrasound. And now we have a few minutes, looks like almost 10 minutes for questions. So happy to start to address those with my other panelists.
And thank you very much, Dr. Foley, for closing out the presentation. I will now throw out a few of the questions that we've received from folks during today's presentation. The first question I am seeing for our panelists is, I recently saw a 60 Minutes episode on CBS about a doctor using focused ultrasound to treat people suffering from drug addiction. Can you speak about that work?
I will chime in there. So that was a wonderful piece. It was done. So that was describing some very early work. We're just so I described reaching in and turning down the amygdala, so the fight or flight center, which so involved in PTSD, depression, anxiety. This is reaching down into those parts of the brain that are involved in perhaps drug abuse, and seeing if we can help them to work in a more normative fashion. So it's important to recognize it's early days yet. And much of what we're doing on the research side is making absolutely sure that it's safe. Once we establish that, then we can roll this out into something more like what we call pivotal clinical trials, where we're really investigating how we can best use the technology.
The second question that I'm seeing here is, this briefing has helped illuminate some really impactful uses of focused ultrasound. Why don't more patients know about focused ultrasound and have access to this non-invasive treatment?
There are many reasons. As we talked about, this is in many cases early stage research for some treatments, and so in that case, patients are not yet aware of it. But even for areas where it is even approved, I think a lot of patients aren't aware of it. Sometimes it's just the nature of who is their physician, and is their physician aware of this? I think there's still a lot to be done in the clinician education aspect of this, building clinician champions throughout the country that are, aware of these treatments, particularly for those that are FDA approved, because a lot of patients, are going to get their information from their doctor, and if that doctor doesn't happen to know about it, or think it's still too early to describe it to their patient, then the patient's not going to have it recommended. And then in many cases, because if it's not covered by insurance, the doctor may not recommend it even if they are aware of it. So that's a big hurdle as well. And so we talked about that as a barrier for these treatments. There can often be a big lag time even between FDA approval and getting Medicare coverage, for instance. So I think we need to cut down that time and get patients access to the treatment as quickly as possible.
Just to add that in pediatrics, this is really in its infancy. That's part of the problem. But I mean, one of the things we're fighting against very hard in pediatrics is that we don't have to wait for all the adult data to be in. There are diseases in pediatrics that are presently not treatable, not only the brain tumors, but forms of epilepsy, forms of neurodevelopmental disabilities, psychiatric disorders. So we just can't wait for all the kinks to be worked out in adults before we give children the opportunity. And that's something we're working hard with the FDA and others that control the use of this drug to understand.
And both of you are touching on another question that came in, which is, can you talk about how focused ultrasound patients in other parts of the world seem to have more access to focused ultrasound than we have here in the United States?
Well, one of the things is that there are focused ultrasound centers being set up around the world. This technology is in Europe now. It's in different places. It's expensive technology, but there's tremendous interest. We're convening a conference in 2 weeks, getting people from Europe, from South America, all together with us to talk about focused ultrasound and its utilizations, because we, to make progress, at least in the pediatrics, have to really be an international effort. So I think this is transmittable information.
Our next question is, women's health has been a topic that has been top of mind recently. Can you talk about how focused ultrasound may be used to treat different debilitating diseases in women, like gynecological cancers or breast cancer?
Well, ironically, the first FDA-approved application of focused ultrasound is for the treatment of uterine fibroids. And so that has actually been FDA approved for nearly 20 years. But the struggle there has really been around insurance reimbursement, which unfortunately has never really come through. So that treatment is unfortunately not very accessible to patients in the country, which is unfortunate because fibroids is a very debilitating condition. But in some of the cancer work, I think we are making progress. And in breast cancer, there's really exciting work that's been taking place at the University of Virginia, combining focused ultrasound with immunotherapies like checkpoint inhibitors, and seeing that the combination really could be a more effective treatment than just the immunotherapy alone. And so that work has been moving, and they're also combining with some chemotherapies as well. So I think that's an exciting development. I think we could see some more work in breast cancer. And then, it's also to note that there are many conditions, things like depression, things like pain that women actually experience more often than men. And we're seeing now, just through talking with, hearing from Terri, hearing from Dr. Phillip about how treatments are progressing in some of those areas, that I think will ultimately benefit a lot of women. Same to be said with Alzheimer's disease, which actually more than 60% of those diagnosed with Alzheimer's are women. And there's a lot of work that we haven't discussed today using focused ultrasound, again, through this blood-brain barrier opening mechanism, the low-intensity ultrasound, to help deliver drugs that could treat Alzheimer's more effectively. And so I think, again, we're going to see a lot of ways in which focused ultrasound could be impactful in the women's health space, whether it's through gynecological issues or through these other issues that impact women disproportionately.
Well, it looks like we are right at 1 p.m. So I will close the briefing by saying thank you to our panelists for educating us all today about this life-changing technology and the promise it holds in the future. I also want to thank those of you who dialed in for giving us an hour of your valuable time. We will share the webinar recording with everyone who registered for this event in the coming days, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your Wednesday.